Hi, I'm Sam Pinard, and the disorder I'm going to be presenting on is PTSD. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and the textbook definition of it is a disorder characterized by haunting memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, numbness of feeling, and/or insomnia that lingers for 4 weeks or more after a traumatic experience. And in the DSM-5, it is classified as a trauma or stress-related disorder, and that basically means that exposure to a traumatic or stressful event is one of the disease criterion for it. So here's a video that gives an overview of PTSD, and it introduces some concepts that I'll go more in depth with on later slides.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, also called PTSD, happens when some memory of a past traumatic event, like war or sexual assault, causes recurrent mental and physical distress. Now, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, or the DSM-5, categorizes PTSD as a trauma and stressor-related disorder. That happens when symptoms of an acute stress response persist for over a month. The main symptoms are psychological ones. For example, someone might re-experience their trauma through nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts. But these can lead to behavioral changes as well. Somebody might start to avoid environments and situations that remind them of their trauma and feel a sense of hypervigilance, where they're constantly on guard, or hyperarousal, where they have this exaggerated startle response to the smallest of triggers.
Okay, so the history of PTSD in 1950 and World War I first really makes people aware that trauma can have a lasting impact on people. At the time, they named the condition shell shock. Some of the treatments included stuff like shock therapy. By the 1950s, the treatments had gotten better. They weren't as inhumane as shock therapy, but there was still a big social stigma that really prevented people from admitting that they actually had trauma. And then in the 1970s, the Vietnam War and the trauma that it caused led to people having a much better understanding of trauma. And so PTSD started to take its modern form and gain its modern definition. And then finally in 1980, PTSD was added to the DSM for the first time. And I think it was the DSM-3 at the time. So etiology. PTSD is caused by experiencing a traumatic event. Some common examples of traumatic events that will cause PTSD include serious accidents, disasters, sexual assault, war, abuse, and torture. So diagnostic criteria. The full diagnostic criteria for PTSD can be found to the right. But to summarize, it basically includes exposure to traumatic events, flashbacks or nightmares relating to the event, avoiding reminders of the event, feeling emotionally detached and unable to be happy, hyperarousal beginning after the event, which hyperarousal basically means like being on edge or jumpy. Symptoms have to last longer than a month. The symptoms have to be causing problems in social situations, work, or other places. And the symptoms cannot be attributed to a substance. So the symptoms cannot be the result of like alcohol or drugs. So the treatments for PTSD usually involve either medications or therapy. Some examples of the medications for PTSD are SSRIs, and some examples of those are fluoxetine, sertraline, and paroxetine. And all of those mostly deal with depression and anxiety. Some examples of the therapy used to treat PTSD include cognitive behavior therapy, which is therapy that helps deal with negative thoughts and behaviors that are caused by the trauma. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which helps deal with stress related to the traumatic event, and then prolonged exposure therapy, which helps deal with stress relating to reminders of the event. So prognosis, symptoms usually begin to appear about 3 months after the trauma. About half of adults will completely recover within 3 months after the symptoms start to appear, but others can remain, that's supposed to say symptomatic, anywhere from 1 to 50 years, so it really varies. Then after someone has recovered, reminders of the trauma can cause symptoms to start to reappear. So, anyways, prevalence and comorbidity. About 5 to 10% of people that experience a traumatic event will develop PTSD, and about 3.5% of American adults had it in the past year. And so that works out to about 3 million cases in the U.S. per year. And then as for comorbidity, having PTSD means that someone is 80% more likely to have another mental disorder as well. For example, the co-occurrence of PTSD and TBI in veterans is about 48%, And then PTSD and major neurocognitive disorder also have significant comorbidity. And some other disorders that have comorbidity with PTSD include depression, substance abuse, and anxiety. For my case study, I chose to do Billy Pilgrim from the novel and movie Slaughterhouse-Five. So Billy Pilgrim was drafted into World War II in 1944. He was captured pretty early on, so he spent most of his time during the war as a POW. He was held in Dresden when it was bombed. And if you don't know, the bombing of Dresden was a fire bombing, and it was very destructive and deadly. There's a picture of it on the right. After the war, Billy becomes an optometrist and gets married, but then he gets in a plane crash where he's the only survivor, and he goes into a coma. And then on the way to see him after the crash, his wife gets in a car accident. And because of the car accident, her car starts leaking carbon monoxide, but she doesn't realize it. And so then she dies from the carbon monoxide poisoning. And so then after he wakes up, Billy goes on the radio and starts claiming that he was abducted by aliens and spent a year in an alien zoo on a planet called Tralfamadore. So the evidence that Billy Pilgrim has PTSD. So first of all, he claims that throughout the novel that he's been time traveling. Like he thinks that he's jumping back and forth in time between when he was in the war and after the war. But what's likely actually happening is that he's experiencing flashbacks to the war, and that is a symptom of PTSD. Some other evidence is that other POWs during the war don't want to sleep next to him because they say he whimpers and kicks in his sleep. This could be a sign that he'd already developed PTSD even as early as during the war, because nightmares are a symptom of PTSD. Next, he also believes that he was abducted by aliens, which could be his way of dealing with some of his trauma, especially because he first goes on the radio and mentions the aliens after his plane crash and his wife's death. The added trauma of those could have worsened his condition, and he could be using the aliens as a way to avoid dealing with his emotions. And avoidance of emotions is another symptom of PTSD, which ties into the last point that he seems to almost feel neutral and unemotional about most things going on. Like throughout the book, when people die, he just says, "So it goes," and seems to just accept things as they're happening and doesn't really react to them. And so this could be a sign of detachment, which is another sign of PTSD. So for treatment, I think Billy Pilgrim would best benefit from therapy. I think the therapy could help deal with the causes of his flashbacks and delusions. Medications are also a possibility, but it seems like the medications are more focused on treating stuff like depression. And so I think that therapy would be the better bet to go with here. Some unique facts about Billy Pilgrim and his disorder are that his flashbacks are used to structure the novel. Like the novel jumps back and forth in time after every couple paragraphs. So reading it is almost like you get the experience of what it's like to have PTSD. He believes he knows how he'll die, which ties in with his delusions. And he also just doesn't even feel emotional about it. Like he thinks that he can see into the future and knows how he'll die, but he doesn't even really seem to care. He just accepts it, which, like I said, again ties in with his detachment of emotion. And finally, he first became obsessed with science fiction in a hospital after the war. I think that this is why he ends up using the Tralfamadorians as a coping mechanism, because science fiction he was first introduced to it right after he got out of the trauma of war. So then later in life, when the trauma of the plane crash and his wife made things traumatic for him again and stressful, then he used science fiction to deal with it. So, yeah, and that's it. Thanks for watching.